Most people think silence means weakness. They think the person who stops talking is the person who gave up. But in avoidant psychology, silence can become something far more dangerous, especially when it comes from a super empath. Because there comes a moment when the empath stops explaining, stops chasing, stops trying to fix everything, and that moment changes the entire emotional dynamic. The avoidant who once felt powerful through distance suddenly starts feeling something they rarely admit to anyone: loss of control. An avoidant can handle anger. They can handle emotional reactions. They can even handle someone begging for their attention because deep down, those reactions still make them feel emotionally important. Those reactions remind them that they still hold emotional power over someone. But there is one thing they almost never know how to handle: emotional detachment from someone who truly understood them. That silence hits differently. It is quiet on the outside, but psychologically it creates chaos internally. One of the lesser-known truths about avoidant attachment is that many avoidants secretly rely on emotional pursuit far more than people realize. They may act independent, they may act emotionally disconnected, they may even push people away repeatedly. But the moment the emotional connection truly disappears, their internal world often shifts in ways they never expected. This is why some avoidants suddenly return months later. This is why some become obsessed after acting cold for so long. And this is why the super empath becomes unforgettable once they finally stop overgiving. A super empath is not weak. They are not emotionally desperate. In fact, they are usually the most patient person in the relationship. They try to understand the pain behind the avoidance. They excuse the emotional distance. They keep giving chances because they genuinely believe love can heal emotional walls. But eventually something changes. The empath begins seeing patterns instead of potential. They begin protecting their peace instead of protecting the connection. And when that emotional shift happens, the avoidant feels it immediately, even if they pretend they do not. There is a reason avoidants often become emotionally confused when a super empath pulls away quietly. It breaks the psychological script they are used to. They expect dramatic endings. They expect emotional chasing. They expect guilt, tears, long messages, and emotional pressure. But calm detachment creates a different kind of emotional impact. It removes certainty, and uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable for someone who spent years controlling emotional distance. Psychologists often describe avoidant attachment as a defense system built around emotional self-protection. Many avoidants learned early in life that vulnerability leads to disappointment, rejection, or loss of independence. So they create emotional walls. They detach during conflict. They suppress emotions. They avoid emotional dependence. But there is another side to this psychology that people rarely talk about. Many avoidants secretly crave deep emotional connection while simultaneously fearing it. That internal contradiction creates emotional confusion that follows them into adult relationships. This becomes especially intense when they meet a super empath, because super empaths do something very few people can do. They make avoidants feel emotionally seen without forcing vulnerability immediately. That emotional safety becomes addictive over time. Even when the avoidant pulls away, a part of them still depends on that emotional understanding being available. That is why the empath's silence becomes so powerful later. The emotional safety they once provided suddenly disappears. And this is where the avoidance ego quietly begins collapsing. Not loudly, not dramatically. Most avoidants will never openly admit it. Their pride usually prevents that. But internally, many begin replaying conversations, overthinking memories, checking for signs, and wondering why the empath no longer reacts the same way. The person they once thought would always stay emotionally available suddenly feels distant. Not because they became cold, but because they finally became emotionally tired. There is also a hidden psychological reason this affects avoidance so deeply. Human beings often value emotional certainty more than emotional intensity. The avoidant may act detached, but knowing someone still emotionally waits for them creates comfort in the background. When that comfort disappears, the nervous system notices. That is why avoidants sometimes react strongly only after the connection feels truly gone. And in many cases, the super empath does not even realize the impact they left behind. Because unlike toxic people who seek revenge, the empath usually leaves quietly. They focus on healing. They stop trying to prove their worth. They stop forcing emotional closeness. That peaceful withdrawal becomes more psychologically powerful than anger ever could. In this video, you are going to learn the 5 major signs that a super empath is silently destroying an avoidance ego without even trying. You will understand why emotional detachment affects avoidance more than emotional conflict, why silence creates delayed emotional reactions, and why some avoidants become emotionally obsessed only after the empath moves on emotionally. You will also learn the hidden psychological patterns avoidants rarely reveal, even to the people closest to them. Some of these signs are subtle, some are deeply uncomfortable truths about emotional power and attachment. But together they reveal something most people completely misunderstand about avoidant psychology. The avoidant is not always affected during the relationship. Sometimes the real emotional collapse begins after the empath emotionally disconnects. By the end of this video, the entire dynamic between super empaths and avoidants will make much more sense. The silence, the distance, the delayed reactions, the emotional confusion, all of it follows a deeper psychological pattern that few people fully understand. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy deep psychological insights, emotional intelligence, relationship dynamics, and powerful truths about human behavior, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss our future videos. And stay until the end, because the final sign explains the one emotional shift that quietly destroys an avoidant's sense of control more than anything else. To understand why a super empath affects an avoidant so deeply, it is important to first understand how the avoidant ego actually works. Most avoidants are not emotionally cold because they feel nothing. In many cases, they learned very early in life that vulnerability felt unsafe. Depending on people, emotionally may have led to disappointment, rejection, pressure, or emotional exhaustion. So instead of openly expressing emotions, they learned how to protect themselves by creating distance. Over time, emotional self-protection becomes part of their identity. They become extremely careful about how much emotion they show. They avoid appearing too attached. They hide emotional needs. Even when they care deeply about someone, they often act calm, detached, or emotionally unavailable because control makes them feel safe. The moment emotions become too intense, many avoidants instinctively pull away, not always because they stopped caring, but because emotional closeness starts feeling overwhelming. This is where their need for control becomes very important. Avoidants usually feel more comfortable when they control the emotional pace of the relationship. They decide when to get close. They decide when to disappear. They decide how much vulnerability is allowed. Emotional distance gives them a sense of power because distance reduces the risk of emotional exposure. The less vulnerable they appear, the safer they feel internally. But there is another side to this psychology that people rarely notice. Even though avoidants pull away from emotional closeness, they often become emotionally attached to people who continue pursuing them. The attention becomes emotionally regulating for them. Deep down, knowing someone still wants them creates reassurance. It feeds the part of their ego that wants to feel emotionally important without fully surrendering control. That is why many avoidants build their identity around being emotionally untouchable. They want to appear hard to read, hard to reach, difficult to affect. They carefully protect the image of being independent and unaffected because vulnerability feels dangerous to them. The moment someone sees through those emotional walls, the avoidant often feels both deeply connected and deeply uncomfortable at the same time. A super empath is very different from the average person an avoidant usually encounters. They do not connect with people on a surface level. They connect emotionally, deeply, and sincerely. They pay attention to emotional shifts that most people ignore. They notice pain behind silence. They notice fear behind emotional distance. And because of that emotional awareness, they often become extremely patient with avoidance for a very long time. A super empath is usually the person who keeps trying to understand instead of immediately walking away. They give second chances, they excuse emotional inconsistency, they try to communicate calmly even when the relationship becomes emotionally exhausting. Their love is not shallow. It is thoughtful, emotionally intelligent, and deeply compassionate. They genuinely want to make the connection work. This is why avoidants often feel unusually safe around them in the beginning. The super empath creates emotional space without immediately demanding vulnerability. They listen carefully. They adapt emotionally. They try to reduce conflict instead of increasing it. For an avoidant, this kind of emotional understanding can feel rare and almost addictive because it lowers their emotional defenses. But the part people rarely talk about is what eventually happens to the super empath over time. At first, they keep giving because they believe empathy can heal emotional distance. But slowly, patterns become impossible to ignore. The disappearing, the mixed signals, the emotional walls, the inconsistency. The super empath begins realizing that understanding someone does not mean endlessly sacrificing themselves for them. And this is where the emotional dynamic starts changing completely. The super empath stops abandoning their own emotional needs just to maintain the relationship. They stop over-explaining. They stop chasing emotional clarity from someone unwilling to provide it consistently. Their empathy becomes controlled instead of limitless. They still care deeply, but they no longer allow that care to destroy their inner peace. The moment a super empath stops over-giving, the avoidant loses the emotional mirror they relied on. The constant reassurance disappears. The emotional safety they quietly depended on starts fading. And for the first time, the avoidant begins feeling the emotional distance they once created themselves. One of the biggest shocks to an avoidant's ego happens when the super empath stops chasing completely. Not angrily, not dramatically, just quietly. That emotional withdrawal affects avoidance far more deeply than most people realize because many of them secretly expect emotional pursuit to continue even after they create distance themselves. In many relationships, the avoidant becomes used to a certain emotional pattern. They pull away and the other person reaches out, they become distant and the other person tries harder. Over time, this creates a sense of emotional predictability. Deep down, the avoidant starts believing the connection will always remain available no matter how detached they become. That emotional certainty feeds their sense of control. This is why the silence of a super empath feels so unsettling. When someone loyal suddenly becomes calm instead of reactive, the avoidant notices immediately. The emotional energy changes. The long emotional messages disappear. The effort fades. The emotional availability that once felt guaranteed becomes uncertain, and uncertainty is extremely uncomfortable for someone who carefully protects emotional control. At first, many avoidants try to ignore it. They tell themselves the empath will eventually return to the usual pattern. But as the silence continues, internal questions begin forming. Why are they so calm now? Why are they not reacting emotionally anymore? Why do they suddenly feel emotionally distant? Did I lose emotional control over them? These thoughts create a type of internal panic that avoidants rarely admit openly. Most avoidants do not express emotional fear directly. Instead, it appears indirectly through overthinking, checking for attention, sudden curiosity, or emotional confusion they cannot fully explain. The absence of pursuit forces them into a position they are not emotionally prepared for. What makes this even more powerful is that the super empath is not trying to manipulate the avoidant. They are simply exhausted. They stop chasing because they finally realize that constantly pursuing emotional closeness with someone emotionally unavailable only drains their peace. And that calm detachment quietly removes the emotional reassurance the avoidant became dependent on without fully realizing it. The second sign appears when the super empath slowly becomes emotionally unavailable. This shift is usually subtle at first, but for an avoidant, it feels deeply unfamiliar. The person who once responded with endless patience suddenly begins responding differently. The emotional warmth becomes quieter, the constant emotional reassurance fades, and the avoidant starts sensing that something important is changing beneath the surface. The empath no longer explains every feeling in detail. They stop trying to fix misunderstandings that were never fully acknowledged. They stop overanalyzing the relationship just to keep the emotional connection alive. Instead of pouring emotional energy into someone emotionally inconsistent, they begin protecting their peace. This change affects the avoidant more than most people expect because they were emotionally used to the empath's openness. The empath was once emotionally predictable, they cared deeply, they reassured constantly, they remained emotionally available even during difficult moments. But now the emotional access feels limited, controlled, distant, and for the avoidant, this creates emotional discomfort they do not know how to process. The empath also stops seeking validation from the avoidant. They no longer wait for emotional crumbs. They stop needing constant reassurance that they matter. That emotional independence quietly changes the entire power dynamic. The avoidant suddenly realizes the empath is no longer emotionally centered around them. This is where the emotional reversal begins. For a long time, the avoidant was the emotionally unavailable one. They controlled closeness through distance, but now they start experiencing the same emotional uncertainty they once created in someone else. Messages feel less emotional. Reactions feel calmer. The emotional intensity they once kept at arm's length is no longer chasing them. And that shift can feel deeply unsettling internally. For the first time, they are the one trying to feel emotionally chosen. That feeling creates confusion because avoidants often do not recognize emotional attachment until emotional access begins disappearing. The empath's emotional withdrawal forces the avoidant into a vulnerable emotional position they spent years trying to avoid themselves. Suddenly they start paying closer attention. They notice delayed replies, they notice emotional distance, they notice the absence of emotional pursuit. And the more emotionally grounded the empath becomes, the more emotionally uncertain the avoidant starts feeling internally. One of the clearest signs that a super empath is silently affecting an avoidant's ego is when the avoidant can no longer trigger emotional reactions from them. This is where the emotional power dynamic begins completely reversing. For a long time, the avoidant may have controlled the relationship through unpredictability. They could disappear for days, become emotionally distant, give small amounts of attention, then suddenly return whenever they wanted. And usually those actions created emotional reactions. The empath would question things emotionally, they would try to reconnect, they would seek clarity. Even frustration, sadness, or emotional confrontation still gave the avoidant a sense of emotional influence. Deep down, those reactions confirmed that the emotional bond was still active and accessible. But eventually something changes. The super empath becomes emotionally steady. The avoidant disappears, but there is no dramatic response anymore. The breadcrumb messages no longer create excitement. Emotional withdrawal no longer creates panic. Even guilt tactics begin losing their effect because the empath stops emotionally revolving around the avoidant's behavior. This shift feels deeply uncomfortable for avoidants because many of them unconsciously rely on predictable emotional access. They feel safest when they know someone is still emotionally available to them, even if they themselves remain inconsistent. The emotional reassurance exists in the background, quietly feeding their sense of control. But once that emotional predictability disappears, their internal stability often weakens. Suddenly, the avoidant cannot fully read the empath anymore. They cannot predict emotional reactions. They cannot control emotional closeness through distance the way they once did. And that uncertainty creates emotional tension they rarely know how to handle. The empath's calmness becomes especially powerful here. They are no longer reacting from pain. They are responding from emotional clarity. Instead of trying to force connection, they focus on protecting their peace. That emotional groundedness quietly removes the avoidant's ability to emotionally influence the relationship through avoidance patterns. And many avoidants secretly struggle when emotional control stops working, because beneath the detached exterior, their ego was often built around the belief that emotional access would always remain open. The moment they feel that access fading, they start noticing something unfamiliar. The person they once thought would always emotionally respond to them is no longer emotionally reachable in the same way. The fourth sign becomes deeply painful for the avoidant on a psychological level because the super empath stops seeing them as emotionally special. In the beginning, the empath often viewed the avoidant through an emotional lens filled with hope, curiosity, and deep emotional meaning. They saw depth behind the silence, complexity behind the distance. They believed there was something uniquely misunderstood about the avoidant, and that belief made the connection feel emotionally powerful. For many avoidants, this quiet admiration becomes part of the emotional dynamic. Their mystery creates emotional intrigue, their emotional distance creates curiosity, and without fully realizing it, they begin maintaining emotional power through unpredictability and emotional ambiguity. The less emotionally available they appear, the more emotionally significant they sometimes seem to the person chasing connection. The super empath once interpreted those behaviors differently. They believed the avoidance emotional walls came from pain, not patterns. They kept searching for emotional meaning behind the inconsistency. They kept giving emotional depth to someone who often struggled to provide the same emotional consistency in return. But eventually, clarity replaces idealization. The empath stops romanticizing the emotional distance. They stop seeing the avoidant as deeply mysterious and begin seeing repetitive emotional behavior instead. The disappearing no longer feels complex. The inconsistency no longer feels emotionally deep. The emotional unavailability no longer feels unique. It simply becomes recognizable. And that realization changes everything. The avoidant starts feeling emotionally exposed because the emotional image they carefully maintained begins collapsing. The empath no longer reacts with fascination or emotional obsession. They become emotionally grounded enough to separate genuine connection from emotional confusion. This can quietly damage the avoidant's ego in ways they rarely express openly. Because now, instead of feeling emotionally untouchable, they begin feeling ordinary, replaceable, human. The emotional mystery that once protected their identity loses its power once someone sees through it clearly. The moment someone stops romanticizing their emotional distance, the avoidant loses the identity they carefully protected. And for many avoidants, that emotional shift feels deeply unsettling internally because their sense of emotional control often depended on remaining difficult to fully understand. Once the empath emotionally detaches from the illusion, the avoidant can no longer hide behind emotional mystery the same way they once did. The fifth sign is often the deepest emotional shift an avoidant experiences, even if they never openly admit it. It appears when the super empath finds peace without closure. This is not a loud ending or a dramatic separation. It is something quieter and far more powerful. The empath simply stops needing answers that were never coming in the first place. Avoidants often operate with an unspoken assumption in relationships. They believe emotional connections remain open-ended. Even after distance, silence, or withdrawal, they assume the emotional thread still exists in the background. In many cases, they also assume the other person will continue waiting emotionally, even if nothing is being said. This creates a silent sense of emotional control where absence still feels impactful. But when the super empath reaches emotional clarity, that expectation breaks. Instead of staying stuck in confusion, the empath begins to heal. They stop replaying unanswered questions. They stop searching for explanations in behavior that was never consistent. Their emotional energy shifts inward. Growth becomes more important than closure. Peace becomes more important than understanding every unanswered moment. And this is where the emotional dynamic changes completely. The avoidant slowly realizes that their absence is no longer producing emotional reactions. There is no emotional chasing, no confusion-driven messages, no unresolved emotional dependence. The empath is no longer emotionally anchored to the situation in the same way. This realization can quietly destabilize the avoidant's ego because it challenges a belief they often carry without even noticing. The belief that emotional absence still holds influence, that distance still creates emotional weight, that silence still keeps someone emotionally attached in some form. But now that belief no longer applies. The empath is not waiting. They are not emotionally stuck. They are not holding on to unanswered closure as something necessary for healing. Instead, they are building emotional independence that does not require the avoidance involvement at all. And that is where the impact becomes undeniable internally, because the avoidant begins to understand something uncomfortable. Their emotional absence no longer controls the empath's emotional state. After all these signs begin to appear, something important starts happening inside the avoidant that most people never see. On the outside, they may still look calm, detached, or even indifferent, but internally, a different process slowly begins to unfold. It is not immediate. It is delayed emotional processing, and it often comes much later than the actual events. Avoidants are not always aware of their emotions in real time. They tend to push feelings away instead of sitting with them. But emotions do not disappear. They get stored, and they return later when the emotional pressure is no longer being avoided. This is where hidden regret starts to form quietly. Not always regret in words, but regret in awareness. Moments they ignored begin replaying in their mind with new meaning. There is also obsessive thinking that starts to appear in subtle ways. Small memories come back repeatedly. Conversations are reanalyzed. The tone of messages is reinterpreted. Things that once felt unimportant suddenly feel significant. The mind keeps returning to the same emotional points, trying to understand what was lost or changed. Alongside this, emotional confusion becomes stronger. The avoidant may not fully understand why they feel unsettled. On the surface, nothing dramatic has happened, but internally the emotional system is no longer stable. The certainty they once had about distance and control begins to weaken. One of the most difficult parts of this process is the loss of emotional certainty. Avoidants often rely on the belief that they are in control of emotional closeness. That belief starts breaking when the super empath no longer reacts in predictable ways. The emotional patterns they were used to no longer apply, and that creates internal discomfort. It is important to understand that avoidants rarely express this openly. Their pride often hides it. They do not usually admit confusion or emotional loss. Instead, they keep it inside, where it slowly builds without being fully processed in real time. But internally, the mind begins replaying everything: conversations, reactions, silence, distance, emotional shifts. Each moment returns with new emotional weight, forming a pattern that becomes harder to ignore over time. The entire dynamic between a super empath and an avoidant does not shift through anger, revenge, or emotional chaos. It shifts in something far quieter, something most people fail to notice until it is already too late. It shifts in emotional self-respect. The super empath does not destroy the avoidant by trying to win or by trying to fight back. They simply reach a point where they stop abandoning themselves for emotional inconsistency. They stop chasing clarity that was never being offered. They stop over-giving to someone who only responds in distance, and in that moment, the emotional balance changes completely. What makes this so powerful is that the avoidant is no longer dealing with emotional reactions they can predict or control. The patterns they once relied on begin to disappear. The emotional pursuit fades, the responses change, the energy shifts, and slowly the control they once felt starts dissolving without any direct confrontation. This is where the ego begins to collapse quietly, not because someone attacked it, but because emotional control no longer works the same way. The avoidant is no longer the center of emotional reaction. They are no longer able to influence feelings through distance alone, and that realization creates an internal shift that is difficult to ignore, even if it is never spoken out loud. The super empath becomes emotionally free, not by defeating the avoidant, but by choosing themselves. And that choice changes everything about the dynamic that once existed between them. An avoidant's ego survives on emotional distance, but when a super empath finally walks away in peace, distance no longer feels like power. It feels like loss. If this video gave you clarity about avoidant psychology and emotional